I think it started. Yes. So today, as you know, we'll be discussing inclusivity. Nana and Mash will share some fresh 2023 data with you, and also they will be showing some bad and good examples of inclusivity, and they'll make sure that you have the right tools for the right approach and execution of inclusivity for you. So we would like to help you as best as we can. So please use the chat box if you have any questions, requests, or comments. Just drop it in the chat box. We'll be answering those questions at the end of this session. And also, before we start, I would like to drop a link here so you can go to that. It's just a one question poll and you can answer to that. So we want to know what you think about your organization when it comes to inclusivity, and you can reply anonymously, totally. We don't know who said what, but we just want to see what people are thinking about their organizations. So yeah, thank you all, and let's start. I'll leave the stage to Mosh.
Sure. Thanks so much, Melis. Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. I'm Mash Muravina. I worked in Glocalities now for 5 years. I'm a senior insights consultant, and a lot of the projects that we work on have inclusivity in them. The most recent ones had were focused on gender inclusivity. So a lot of the examples you will see today will be focused on gender, but a lot of the logic is applied to all of the other areas of inclusivity, of course, as well. And I'm excited to start. Nana, do you want to say a couple of words?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm Nanna. I'm a research consultant here at Glocalities. I've been with Glocalities for almost 3 years. Before that, I had a background in politics and in the NGO space, and I've been working with Mesh on all of these projects of inclusivity. And I'm so excited to show you all of these fun things we've planned. So I think
Yeah.
let's just get started.
Yes, let's dig into it. So, first of all, what is even inclusivity? Why do we even want to talk about it? To start with, just basic definition, it is not excluding people based on their gender, race, class, sexuality, and disability, creating the environments where there is room for diversity, when everybody feels welcome and appreciated. Inclusivity is part of any group dynamic, any organization. And one of the key messages that we want to drive today is that you are taking part in the inclusivity discourse, whether you are doing it consciously or not. So it is at least good to become aware of where you stand, and it is becoming more and more visible for the public. Society cares about it more and more. So it's good to become aware of where you are at and then think what you want to do action wise in regards to that.
Yeah, and how we work with inclusivity here at Glocalities is a lot of different ways. But for example, we work with looking through campaigns, developing campaigns to make sure that you can actually drive change instead of just receiving backlash. A key word to doing this, and I think I will be repeating this word quite a bit today, is authenticity. People, consumers, citizens, the general public are so aware of these issues and how to work with these issues, and are very aware of when greenwashing, pinkwashing, rainbow washing, whatever washing, you name it, happens. So we can help working with these campaigns to avoid that. And then, of course, also creating strategies for actually creating societal change, identifying audiences, how to speak with them, and very importantly, how to frame these issues so that we actually can move some people. And then, of course, we also create thought leadership reports with clients for clients. Those are very public on our website, so please feel free to click around as well when we're done with this. There's lots of interesting stuff on there.
Yeah. So with our clients, we work with all kinds of clients, be it for-profit organizations, NGOs, sometimes even political parties. And even though they're having sometimes different goals, it all boils down to the same logic of how do you drive change and how to deal with the topic in a sensitive way, and an approach that actually drives change as opposed to uh, creates a campaign that not probably, but can often lead to a backlash if you don't do it well. So, first of all, why does it even matter, inclusivity? Apart from the obvious, which is it's actually good to be diverse and inclusive. If that is not an argument enough, we have a few stats for you. So, based on other research, this is not done by us, but it's lit review. Um, when your team is inclusive, when your organization is more inclusive, your team also experiences higher levels of innovation. There is higher levels of team citizenship, so how devoted the workers are inside of it across countries. So it really helps you to become more efficient inside of the organization. This study was more focused on gender equality. Again, just because this is the most recent project that we've done, so it's really top of our mind. But the logic is the same for other kinds of groups and minorities. In case of gender equality, when you have gender equality in an organization, you are also improving financial performance, strengthening organizational climate, leveraging talent, increasing innovation, which we also saw from a different study, and in general, having a good reputation. So, if you need to convince other stakeholders on why inclusivity is good for you money wise, there's actually data that supports it. Now, this is some part of the studies that we've done. We do multicultural research across years. This is based on 20 countries worldwide. And we see that through the years, we have rising trends of tolerance, people becoming more and more open to other people with different religions or walks of life. There's a growing trend for gender role flexibility. So men showing their feminine side more, women showing their masculine side, and also brand origin. So wanting to know what is the story behind the brand and what does the brand stand for. And those trends are even stronger amongst younger population. So Gen Z cares about those topics even more. So that means that they look out for them more. They're also a lot more critical, and it matters a lot more. What we see a lot with our clients, sometimes they struggle with an aging consumer group, and they don't know how to attract younger audiences. Um, through having a purpose-driven brand and inclusivity is one of the key ways to do it, but you also have to do it right because they are also the most critical group that's going to look at how authentic you are. This is based on the 2023 data that we just did. We did it across all of the countries, but here we're just showing a snippet from the UK. We closed fieldwork just weeks ago, really. So it's very, very fresh. And we had a chapter in our questionnaire that looked at all kinds of inclusivity topics and support of them, including public support. So what we see is overwhelmingly there is very high support of at least one inclusivity topic. And then it huffs when we look at people who publicly support it, which means two things. Whoever you're seeing vocally supporting it, whether it's online or in person, that is just still a share of how the sentiment actually is. But it also means that when you want to grow the support of a subject even further, you need to activate the silent supporters, the allies, to become more active supporters and do it publicly. What are the reasons for people not supporting certain topics publicly, even when they are the silent supporters? Across the board, the top three reasons were it's not a problem for me, I don't feel the need, or I'm not personally affected by this issue. So a lot of it has to do with growing the culture of seeing the value of being the ally and supporting topics that you are not necessarily affected by yourself. And we're going to also prove it to you on examples later on. But it also, the reasons, how strong different reasons are, varies per topic. So when it comes to racial inequality, it is not a problem for me, is a much stronger reason. So if you are not a subject to discrimination when it comes to racial inequality, then you oftentimes think that, well, if I'm not personally being racially abusive, then what else do you need from me? So it is important to show the value of allyship and active support. When it comes to topics like mental health conditions and illnesses, reasons that came out stronger were me speaking out will not change anything. I'm afraid of what people will think of me. So if you speak out on Mental Health Week, for example, or about anxiety, then you fear of what does it mean in the eyes of my colleagues? Am I going to be perceived differently? So then you have to fight stigma in a different kind of way. So you approach those topics differently, but the overall arcing strategy would be similar.
Yeah, and before we dive a bit more into some research we've done, I would like to show you some examples of some ways that these things can go wrong, some pitfalls to avoid, but also some good example of how to do it right. And I do want to stress before I go into these sort of cases that went wrong, please don't let it scare you. I'm going to show a bit how publicly aware this is, how many people are interested in these issues and how fast it can go, and then go through some pitfalls to avoid, but please don't let it scare you. It is great just to work with this. So first, I think a very funny example, an excellent example, a classic we want to be inclusive and show that we're inclusive is a big group photo to show how many different kinds of people we have. And that is what Vogue did a couple of years ago for this big women rule issue. And as you can see in the picture, perhaps it's not that diverse. A huge problem in the fashion industry in particular is size inclusivity, and they did include one plus size model in this photo. Then they also tried to hide her between the other ones and by some very unfortunate Photoshop, which was called out immediately. And people were very angry. Vogue received a lot of backlash because it doesn't look good. And it looks tokenistic. It looks like they wanted to do this to look right, but didn't try hard enough and didn't try thoughtfully. Another way that we can see a lot of criticism, I think this is a very fun example, is a bot on Twitter. It's an account that was created for International Women's Day last year. So every time a company or organization tweeted in support of Women's Day, the bot would reply by saying how big the gender pay gap in that specific organization was. And some of these examples are grim, to be honest. But it's also just an example of how quick these things are and how aware these people are, especially on the internet, but also that people are so happy to engage, but also criticize with this, but also they want to see change. People are very aware of the gender pay gap, for example, and just tweeting sort of flat statements or platitudes or the Beyonce who run the world's gif is not really enough anymore. People want to see how you're changing and the work you're doing rather than just a nice picture. Some other pitfalls to avoid. We do see companies realizing this, for example, Gen Z or younger people being more into social issues and then taking sometimes too sharp of a turn. A classic example or a new modern example, I guess, is the Gillette ad from a couple of years ago that was sort of saying men could be better, let's not be toxic masculine, which is a lovely image, maybe a message in itself, but because Gillette ads used to look like the picture I've put below, with a clean-shaven man and a woman who comes to kiss him, people were a bit surprised, perhaps, by the sharp turn, which is why it also created a lot of backlash. Perhaps also because, yeah, sorry?
Yeah, I want to mention something about this particular case. it was because they didn't build the reputation and the history, and the people that they tried to attract with it, for them it was too strong of a sharp turn, and they didn't see it as authentic. Having said that, they still are now laying the groundwork for future campaigns to become more and more believable, because this is how they're now starting to build their reputation. I want the learning to be the learning to take away from that to be is, even if right now you're thinking, don't need my organization to be a spokesperson in inclusivity right now, or we can do it, not do it for another 5 to 10 years. When you decide to be very publicly outspoken about inclusivity, what you are doing right now will matter. So if you are not doing anything and not laying any groundwork, then it's not going to come across as authentic. So even if you're not trying to make it at the forefront of your organization's identity, it's still going to be scrutinized later on. So it's important to start preparing the groundwork now, even if you're not planning on doing a campaign about it in the next year or so.
Yeah, absolutely. The savior complex is also a sort of a narrative that we see in otherwise usually very well-meaning organizations trying to help people. It then ends up perhaps not helping the people they want to help as much, and maybe even disadvantaging them. I think the sort of very prominent example is a white savior narrative. I put Sharon there, or Pretty Woman, where a man saves a woman. But I also think the example below, it's an example of how when able-bodied people can see this, they think, oh, that's amazing. Look, we're just wheelchair users and non-wheelchair users will walk on these stairs together side by side. However, it's not accessible at all for a wheelchair. There are no rails. That incline is incredibly steep. So it's also, again, this is a very important point. Ask the people that you are trying to help what they actually need. And then, of course, tokenism. Wanting to be inclusive is great. And wanting to have, for example, women in your board. I put the UEFA Executive Committee up there. Or gay characters in a movie. I put an example from Star Wars. I'm sorry, I don't remember which Star Wars it was, but this was quite a hyped moment that was before the movie talked a lot up about two characters being women and being in a couple. And it then turned out to be a literally blink and you miss it picture, which is also why the picture I've picked here is quite grainy, because it went so fast. And then it ends up, well, first of all, not really doing anything, because these characters, for example, aren't being used for anything. Or in an organizational setting in a company, you can also have a woman, have a minority person. But if you're not giving them power, if you're not considering them with the same authority, if you're just having them there to have them, then of course that's not going to be helpful. So yes, some example of how it can go right, thankfully. Fenty is a brand that both does beauty and fashion. They released a line of foundations that was a lot of colors, which has been a problem for a lot of, well, women mostly who use foundation, for example, that they couldn't get the right color. And this brand then presented, I think it's more than 50 colors for their foundation. So you can actually, you don't have to mix and match and create all the chemistry at home. This also then seems authentic when the same brand releases an underwear line. And as the picture below, they have lots of people have different sizes, different colors as well. And it matches the brand, and it seems authentic, because we've seen this picture before as well with all these people below in a Tommy Hilfiger ad or the Gap or whatever, where it looks like you try to get one of each, but when then Fenty does it, it seems much more authentic. And then, of course, we have the Always example, which was very fun ad, sort of reversing the it's bad to be a girl because girls can't throw. You throw like a girl, you kick like a girl, whatever. Showing that girls, of course, can swing and throw and be leaders as much as boys can.
Yes,
Yeah,
always. And like a girl was our client at some point, and actually the person that we work closely with is in the audience today. So it's humble brag. We're very proud of that collaboration. But yes, that is just an example of when um, an inclusivity and diversity campaign is done right, and it is authentic and it makes sense, and
and
it
it matches the
also,
brand, and it matches the people who use the
yes,
brand.
great.
Yeah, so when you're working with inclusion, diversity, and such, we're trying to think of knowledge in action as sort of umbrella. So if you see all these systemic issues you have in an organization and in society, societal stigma, unconscious bias, behavior, sort of rain dropping down, you need knowledge and you need action as an umbrella to protect your and empower your initiatives. Those initiatives are then, of course, both internal and external, and they all tie together. Again, because of authenticity, but also, again, just because it works better in an organization. I think Mesh has some examples.
Yes. A lot of times we treat it as very separate objects. How are we doing in terms of our HR internally in an organization? What our employees are thinking? What is going on with our consumers, potential donors, potential voters, viewership? But at the end of the day, everybody is holding the same societal biases and stereotypes. They're just doing it in different roles. So the way you approach it is actually quite similar to each other. And you can't just approach it on one area, for example, just in your campaigns, and not see what's happening within your organization internally. You have to have a more holistic, wholesome approach. I also, before I go into the examples of some of the biases and stereotypes that we hold, I want to mention that every single person holds biases and stereotypes. That is a very human and natural way of information reduction that our brain needs to do to make sense of the world and process information as opposed to being too overwhelmed. And most of the times, it actually works and it helps us make sense of the world. But this is exactly the same mechanism that ends up creating stereotypes and biases and problems with diversity and inclusion. So when we approach these topics, it is important to not be to accept it within ourselves so that you can actually address it, and to understand why they're happening within others so that we can actually do something about it and become more conscious of that. So now we're going to show you some of the examples. Again, these are examples that are going to be about gender equality because it is the latest project that we've done. But again, it is similar logic that applies to all other diversity topics. So when it comes to confidence, gender gap, there's a gap in confidence. Men are more socialized to be confident, assertive, and self-promoting. Women are and girls are often penalized for that. So when they are showing these traits, which are often associated also with the leadership traits, they are being penalized for that, and they are socialized to show those traits less of. So what often ends up happening is that when they self-assess, men tend to overestimate their performance and women tend to underestimate their performance. Both men and women miss the mark when it comes to self-evaluation, but it is important to know that this is a thing that tends to happen when you are, for example, going through an HR process, that you have the lens and you know that statistically this thing is happening. When, yeah.
Yeah, this happened. I did this test once in my school when a teacher was about to give us grades. He said it to us very clearly. This is going to happen. The girls are going to underestimate. The boys are going to overestimate. And still, with that knowledge, we did exactly that. And of course, yeah, as Mesh says, this carries on in the rest of the life, not only schools.
Yeah. Then, of course, there are a lot of ideas of how men and women are really different. Therefore, of course, we should treat them differently. But thankfully, there is a lot of research on that. So this is based on 46 meta-analyses, and they looked at 120 plus different characteristics on how men and women are really different. And they looked at variables that like cognitive variables, verbal, nonverbal communication, social personality variables, psychological well-being, motor behaviors, moral reasoning. Things that they did not look at were brain differences, physical health, and sex hormones. And out of those 120 plus characteristics, overwhelming majority of them had very small or close to zero differences between men and women. We're not saying there are no differences. Also within genders, there are massive differences, but to generalize them into men and women is a very simplistic, lazy, and very wrong way to do it because it actually doesn't represent the differences. If you're curious which differences were those that had big enough differences, don't worry, we're not going to gatekeep those. So where men and women were different were in 3D mental rotation, agreeableness, sensation seeking, interests in things versus people, physical aggression, sexual behaviors like porn use, and attitudes about casual sex. Now, if you are thinking about promoting women into leadership positions, things like porn use never should be a consideration factor. But most of the times, 3D mental rotation is not either. So there is no factual reasoning behind why men would be more qualified to be leaders than women. But we still hold these stereotypes when we imagine a leader. Oftentimes, unfortunately, it is a man. And so this is a battle that we need to fight. And we're going to have a bit more on that because that is one of the projects that we did, and we can't share that information publicly.
Yeah, so looking back into the umbrella, this knowledge in action supports and helps both internal and external efforts. So internally, for example, in being aware of your biases, both as a person and as an organization, all those biases that Mash just went through, but then also affirmative and positive action in HR decisions. So in hiring situations, promoting situations, in defining company values, it is important to both be aware of your actions and where you stand and where you are, but also make sure you're not overlooking people just because, women act differently or introverts act differently, something like that. So you want to make sure that everyone gets a chance. And then, of course, knowledge and action can also help you externally in campaigns, but then, of course, also in defining and redefining brand values, making sure that everyone feels included in that. And then, very importantly, in developing new products, it makes a lot of sense to include the people you want to use the products in the development and ask and listen. So to make sure that everyone's thoughts are included and everyone will feel heard and can actually use it. So our framework for working with diversity, inclusion, and societal change in general is sort of created by these 3 legs. First, understanding the landscape, then identifying groups to drive the change, and then shifting the attitudes, social attitudes. So first, to understand the landscape, you need to do some research and understand the issue and the landscape the issue is working in. Who are the actors, but who also why does the landscape look as it does? What is the history? And also, again, please ask. You need to ask, of course, the people you're trying to help. If you're trying to help someone specific, those need to be included from the start in the research process, so the right questions are already asked from the beginning. Then you want to identify the groups, the core actors, your critics, your silent supporters who are maybe positive about the issue but aren't publicly screaming and yelling about it. And then your activists who are doing exactly that. Also, this is important to identify because you need to understand why they think the way they think about these issues, which will then help you understand how to communicate about these issues to them exactly. So what are their values? How are these related to these issues? And how can you use that knowledge to talk to them? And then when you've done that step, you can start trying to shift societal attitudes. Remember to speak to each actor at their level. Silent supporters probably don't need the same level of information, or they need different communication than an activist. Someone who's already very engaged does not need the basic information about an issue, for example.
But they might need, for example, a guide on how they should be convincing the critics.
Exactly. So, for example, a guide so they can be ambassadors instead of, yeah, exactly. And then what's also often very appreciated is not just to provide information and facts, but also solutions, actions people can take. When people see these facts and these problems, they want to get involved. And having an easy way for them to do that is always very helpful. And then, of course, remember, when people feel attacked, they automatically go into defending themselves. This also can happen even though you don't necessarily thought that you were attacking them, but people can feel attacked. For example, that Gillette ad was not necessarily an attack, I think, on a lot of men, but perhaps some people felt that way anyway. That was why the criticism was so big. But that is, again, then why you need to understand sort of who your audiences are and how to speak to them differently. And then, of course, throughout the whole process, it's important to look inward, again, both as an organization, but also as a person. What is my role in this? How am I contributing? And then, of course, providing inclusivity in decision-making rooms, again, in each step, also in deciding in the research process what questions should be asked, is so important because you miss out if you don't already think this in from the beginning.
So the framework sounds great, but what does it actually mean in practice? We're going to share with you a case study that we've done recently on how we tackled one of the inclusivity issues there with research and how we approached it to give you maybe an inspiration for an inclusivity problem that you might be running into. So this was a study that we did commissioned by Still Out There. The goal was to have more women in leadership positions across the world, and they wanted to see how we can drive that societal change. So one of the things that we asked was which qualities apply to you the most out of this list. And we broken them into men and women. In general, this research is going to be broken into men and women. We didn't have big enough sample to profile non-binary people. Of course, they are also crucial when it comes to gender inclusive leadership. But just for sample purposes, we're going to look at these two groups. So when people had to answer this question about themselves, they saw themselves quite as multifaceted individuals, whether they are a man or woman. It was quite similar scoring on these factors, more or less. However, then when we asked the question, which of these qualities do you associate more with men and women? This is where we saw massive stereotypes appear. Men are perceived as strong, risk-taking, competitive, determined, assertive, persuasive, rational, all of the things which, by the way, are what people also associate with what a leader is. And women were seen as sensitive, emotional, kind, patient, attentive, supportive, and flexible. If this were the same people that had to answer that question about themselves, how do they see themselves? They self-assessed as quite diverse on all those factors, whether they're a man or a woman. But even then, they still showed to hold this massive stereotypes that evidently are not true. We also asked them, in general, the perception of a gender equality in leadership. What do actually people want? And oh, by the way, important to mention, this was a research done across 11 countries, and with quite a big sample. So the fact that across those cultures, people really wanted to be in support of gender equality, that the progress is going too slow, that it is important for them to have more women in leadership positions in the future, that they think that women are unfairly disadvantaged compared to men. There was an overwhelming support. Yes, women agree with those things a lot more than men do, but even men overwhelmingly tend to agree with that, even though those are still the people that held those stereotypes. Another thing that we looked at was mentorship system. We looked at how men and women are receiving help from mentors and peers uh, between both genders. And what we noticed is that the current structures that we have are automatically set against women. There's always an in-group bias, so men are more likely to help men and women are more likely to help women. But men have that in-group bias a lot stronger, so men are a lot more likely to help other men. And also, there are, in general, right now, more men in leadership positions. Also, when it comes to peer support, for example, you see that uh, male peers support men 33%, but support women only 16%. So with a massive gap. So the way things are set up naturally, women are getting less support, which means you need to create extra programs to help and mentor women on top of it, not to create extra opportunities that men don't have, but to equalize the field, because the way it's set up right now, it is women are getting less help. We also asked people what do they think are the key reasons why there are more men than women in leadership positions. And interestingly enough, both men and women, they kind of went in the same order of priority of agreeing of what were the key reasons. To a different extent, but still, that was an interesting finding. The top reason was they think that it's hard for women to balance personal and professional lives. But then the second and third reasons were gender stereotypes and men not recognizing women's abilities, which is also what men believe is the core thing that stops women. So there is a call to fight stereotypes, and there is a call to change this perception amongst women, amongst men, especially certain subgroup of men. We also asked people what do they think would be the greatest impact when it comes to women in leadership. And we saw an overwhelming agreement between genders, between countries, on what are the top three reasons. The first one was the equal responsibility between women and men in family care, but then the second one was against stereotypes and promoting role models. And there is a consensus across cultures and across genders. So, um, interestingly, also, these are the same people that we showed were holding the stereotypes to begin with. So fighting stereotypes and fighting biases is quite a tricky battle. You can be against inequality and still not realize how you're holding certain beliefs. So it is always important to investigate it within yourself and never be combative about it. Because then people start defending themselves as opposed to investigating their internal biases. So, how do we tackle this now that we see that we really need to fight this stereotypes? We looked at the key actors, like Nana mentioned, on this particular debate. We looked at 6 groups, but to illustrate the example here, we're only going to show 3 of them. The first being women who are potential leaders. Who are they? So these are women who have the ambition to become leaders but are not leaders currently. So this is the group that we want to help, and we want to ask them how would they like to be helped. So what do we know about their profile? They believe that they deserve to be further along in their career, but being a woman makes it much harder. They often prioritize others over themselves. They call for dismantling gender stereotypes, and they call for men to be converted from a major roadblock to a solution. So that means, how does we help them? These women, of course, need to be given space to grow. They feel the outside weight of gender roles in careers and families. We need to create programs for women lifting each other up, because, as we saw, women tend to help other women a lot more. And in general, this group already tends to help each other more. So we need to create more systematic platforms when they can do it more efficiently. And most importantly, we need to create more trainings targeted at everyone, not just women. A lot of the trainings are made for women in leadership. But we need to create trainings for all, including trainings for men, on the false societal stereotypes and why gender inclusive leadership is beneficial for everyone. This is not just a women's issue that women should solve, it benefits the entire organization, including men. Another group that we looked at was men passive supporters. So those are who very much agree that there should be more women in leadership, but are not actually doing anything currently about it. So they support the cause, they don't act on it. What else is true about them? They see men not recognizing women as a key problem, but they also see fewer benefits of involving men in the conversation. They also, when it comes to confidence in their own ability to lead, they are less confident than men who are active supporters. So men who were active supporters of women in leadership were the most confident men across the board. Um, what does that mean? How do we activate them? It is important to help them connect man as a problem and man as a solution, including their own responsibility. A lot of the internal monologues that are happening, if you are not a part of the group that is affected by certain discrimination, is I don't hold those beliefs. I'm not doing anything harmful. What else do you want me to do? Um, what else is important is to give them examples of like what they can do, because it can be very vague to be like, please be an ally. What does that actually mean? These are the steps you can take, and provide more structural opportunities for them to advocate, especially to other less convinced men, because unfortunately, people in the backlash, men in the backlash, currently right now are more prone to listen to other men's arguments than to women's arguments. So it is crucial if we want to change overall societal shifts and opinions to involve men as allies in this case. For other diversity and inclusivity issues, if you're not part of the group that is being discriminated against, you are very key and your allyship is very crucial for changing um, the perceptions. And then the final group that I want to talk about is men in the backlash. Who are they? It is still very important to understand where they are coming from. So, men in the backlash are more likely to be unsatisfied with their careers. They hold the belief that men are natural leaders, but they themselves are not confident in their own ability to lead. So, when you think men should lead, I don't think I can lead, it is hard to imagine, well, how would a woman be a good leader, even if I don't feel it in myself? They also experience a lot of hardship themselves, and it is hard for them to imagine that had they were a woman, then maybe it would be even harder because they are already experiencing a lot of roadblocks. They find gender inclusive initiatives like extra programs and promotions, they find it unfair because they feel like somebody is being pushed in front of them, um, which is not deserved. And in their values, they're focused highly on their own status. It's very much self-centered. So what does that mean in terms of the actions you take? Of course, naturally, it is going to be the hardest group to convince. It is important to stress that this is not an anti-man movement. You're not trying to push men down. It is important to acknowledge that the struggles that they are experiencing are valid and try to communicate that had they were a woman, the struggles would probably be even harder. And finally, like Nana mentioned, through affirmative action, because their values are so much centered around their own status, to communicate that their status will be harmed if they exhibit discriminatory behaviors and attitudes, if all the previous arguments didn't work. Now, this was just an example on gender equality in leadership, but to recap, what I would like you to take away from this is you and your organization are already engaging in inclusivity and inclusivity discourse, you might not be doing it consciously. You might not realize what role you're playing in it, but it is happening already. And if you are part of an organization that is being vocal publicly, it is going to be scrutinized if it's not already. So it is important to be mindful about it and know exactly what role you're playing. Uh, Even if you're not thinking about the reputation and increasing your consumer base and donor base and voters and supporters, in general, just within your own organization, inclusivity benefits your organization's talent, benefits your inner performance. And of course, consumers and voters and donors are looking for it as well now more and more. And there are more and more ways of keeping organizations accountable, like that bot that Nana showed. And finally, again, with that, people are more and more critical of claims of inclusivity. So you have to approach it mindfully. It's not enough just to stick a rainbow during a Pride Month. It is important to understand what is the landscape of the issue that you are approaching. And the group that you are trying to help, what do they actually need? To make sure you are in active conversation with them, that they are part of the decision making as well. Understanding also the agents inside of the debate, what their values are to get across your message effectively. What we tend to do is we gravitate towards arguments that worked for us and worked for like-minded people, and then we kind of end up preaching to the choir inside our own echo chamber, instead of trying to step into the shoes of people that are not convinced yet and we are trying to convince, and what is their core values from which they are going to be more persuaded better, and try to speak on that level instead. So this was our core message of this webinar in a nutshell. Um, if you have any questions or things to discuss, this is the moment to throw it out in the chat, and Nana and I will try to answer them.
Thank you, Mash. And there are already questions in the chat box. So
Great.
I can read it if you want. If are you able to see?
Mhm.
Javier asked, are there differences between Western and Asian countries?
Yes. There are different, actually, Martijn is in the call and he did like a whole study specifically on that. And we are still yet to dive into it on the 2023 data because it just came through. But there are definitely differences between those markets, but we see those trends rising up in all economies. They might the Western economies might be a little bit more far ahead in terms of how much they care, but across the board, countries care about it more and more. Also, we want to mention sometime it is important to keep in mind the cultural differences, but I do want to warn that when you censor yourself too much, for example, you have one sort of campaign in the US, but then you do something polar opposite in Asia, because it is globalized world and people see that and they're scrutinizing it, and this is can very much be a source of a backlash if you are not consistent, if you are very vocally and actively supporting one group and then are not carrying through that support in other markets. um, this is something that opens you up for criticism amongst consumers, supporters, voters, and so on.
Yeah, that example with the two women kissing in the Star Wars film was, well, first it was so short and so inconsequential that it could easily be cut out, but it was also, which then just gives even more criticism because you're not meaning what you're saying then, which of course doesn't look good.
Ooh, we have a question. All right, what are the role of the education in creating a self-confidence for women? Yes, I think it is a great question. I think it needs to um, this kinds of confidence issues, they start happening from the very early age. We saw some studies where even when you dress babies in pink and blue and just let adults interact with them, they start interacting completely differently, and they treat girls as very fragile things, and they talk to them in a different voice, and they treat boys, oh, who's a big boy? So how we interact with kids already sets them up for whether they are penalized or whether they are celebrated for being a certain way. So it is important from the early ages to celebrate it. I think it's quite unfair to penalize girls and women for being outspoken or bossy instead of calling them assertive when they're earlier on, and then saying, oh, but then you just have to lean in and become more confident as an adult woman, because then it is just confusing messages, and you are the group that you've been programming in society in a certain way, then you're penalizing the same group for and putting all of the responsibility on them. So it is important from early age to build that confidence in girls, and to also educate everybody about the stereotypes and the stereotypical behaviors that we tend to push boys and girls into, and be more aware of it, because the more it becomes aware you get, the more it moves from the unconscious bias to consciously being aware of where this click is happening.
We have another question. How to
Yes.
build team for inclusion initiative within a company? How approach people from which level?
Yes, I think it is important to do it on a multi-level, from C-suite to HR, hiring decisions, to whoever is involved in promotions. But also, as you saw, peer support matters a lot as well. I think these kinds of bias trainings, it's important to hold them at all levels. Um, I think it should be part of general HR policy, and it should never be as an attack. I think you hold biases, you're not doing well. Yeah, I'm going to punish you, go do a bias training. It should be something for everyone, because absolutely every person holds biases. That's just how human brain works. But the more we work with them, the more we make them conscious, the better the decisions that we're taking become.
Yeah, and also so importantly, having different kinds of people in decision-making rooms, in hiring, in promotion. It is so important, both also having women, but also just having, or whoever the minority is, but also having just people who think differently. Because we tend, for example, to hire people who look like us. In Danish, we call it the effect of, I don't know what they're called in English, the nephews of Donald Duck, because people hire people who look exactly like them.
Yeah,
So
there's
just
an in-group
having,
bias. That's the
exactly.
term for that. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So just having people who think differently or who appreciates different values and characteristics, for example, in a hiring or promotion situation, helps a lot. But it also, for example, I heard a story about someone who applied for a position at Shell and couldn't get one because they had experience at an NGO, which is also, it's a different example, but it's also, that person will think differently. It could have probably helped Shell quite a lot. So that also counts a lot.
Thank you, Xavier, and thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, everyone, who joined. Um, yes, we can definitely map it. That Xavier knows our maps, because we do this cultural research in 20 plus countries, and the inclusivity chapter that we just finished polling was also done across the board. So, of course, it is important to understand cultural differences and why uh, the cultures are different, where their values are coming from when you are trying to change societal attitudes, because you're going to be talking to them through a different lens and frame. Um, oh, thank you for the podcast suggestion. So we'll check
Thanks,
those out.
Lauren.
Yes. And thank you for everyone who joined. If you want to discuss it more or have a call to dive deeper into the data, or you have more follow-up questions, feel free to send an email to me or Nana or Melis or Martijn, and we're going to be very happy to chat with you again.
And please follow us on LinkedIn so that you can learn about our upcoming webinars and events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.